Hello, and welcome to our discussion on evaluating evidence. Today, we are going to talk about how to test a source's credibility, some common reasoning biases, the importance of evaluating every aspect of an argument, how to assess if an argument is valid and if it should inform your decisions moving forward, and personal principles to always keep in mind when presenting arguments to someone. Okay, so let's start off with source credibility. Now, you can use sources and arguments in a variety of contexts, right? And obviously, we've seen a lot of headlines recently about whether it's bias, news, misinformation, right? All of this sorts of stuff that's out there in the ether. And so the question kind of becomes, so how do you test if a source is actually credible? Now, there's a variety of tests you can use that I'm sure you've heard of. I'd like to go through the following sort of elements, which is reliability bias. Are other outlets reporting it, and is it current? So, reliability bias, is it pervasive information, and is it current? So, let's talk about reliability. What reliability basically refers to is this information coming from a source who would know or is typically accurate about this piece of information or whatever it is they're opining on? So let's say they are the source that you're getting the information from is the source themselves. So they say A is true because I'm telling you A is true. I was there, I would know, right? Excuse me. So the question is the person that's telling you A is true, are they somebody who's normally right? Okay, are they somebody that would know? Do they have the either insights or expertise or knowledge to know? That's basically what you're asking with reliability. Now, when it says there reliability of author and sources, that basically is just pointing out that sometimes there's two levels to reliability. So the first level to reliability is like I just mentioned, which is the person if they're the source of the information, do I think they would know? Are they typically accurate? Would they be accurate? The second level of their sources means sometimes somebody is reporting information, but they're not necessarily the ones who you have to ask yourself, would the sources they got the information from be reliable? So in other words, sometimes somebody can be reliable who's the where you got the information, sort of the talking head that gave you the information, but where they're getting their sources might not be reliable. So you have to like sort of dig into that second level basically. So if they are not the first hand account of that information or the one who's giving that opinion, they're sort of reporting on somebody else's data or somebody else's evidence or somebody else's information. You then have to ask yourself, is the somebody else, are they reliable, right? Would they know? Do I have access to that information? So those are kind of like the two levels that come into play of reliability. Now, bias is slightly different because somebody can be reliable but still be biased. Okay, and this is actually the first sort of point where where people are sort of easily manipulated or deceived. So, in other words, you can have somebody who, on paper, has the credentials, the experience, or even the connections, the insight, right, to give you reliable, accurate information. They should know, right? But do they have a reason to be biased? So, an example, obviously, the most common reasons might be a financial motive. So, this would be, for example, you have a doctor and they're a medical expert, but yet, and they give an opinion, right? Well, if let's say that doctor, like a team of doctors and nutritionists and scientists or what have you, they were commissioned to do a report on is aspartame. Aspartame is the artificial sweetener that is used in a lot of beverages, right? Like, for example, Diet Coke or Diet Pepsi and things like that. Is aspartame harmful to humans? Does it cause cancer? Right. And so you have these medical researchers, they do this study and they come out and they say it is not harmful to humans. Drink up, enjoy a Coke, right? So they are reliable on the surface. They have the medical background, they have the research background, right, to tell you whether or not to give you what you would believe would be an accurate opinion, and also to conduct the study in a vigorous, valid way, right? Now the problem is, what if they're being paid by Coca-Cola to do the study, right? What if PepsiCo is paying them to do the study? That's where the bias comes in. So oftentimes you'll see people that have the credentials to be reliable, but when you look at who's paying them, right, to give those opinions, if they're a paid consultant, paid contributor, you name it, right? That's where the bias can come in. And so sometimes you have to ask yourself that. And again, this goes to the author and the sources. So the difference is, again, the author is basically when you get information from somebody and they're giving the firsthand account. They're like, it's my data, it's my information, it's my opinion. I don't have a source. The source is me, right? You got to ask yourself, are they biased? Just like you ask yourself if they're reliable. Now, if they have secondhand sources, they're like, well, I got the information from somewhere else, and that's now where I'm giving you this opinion. That's where you have to ask yourself, would the place you got the, when with the person or the people or the place where they gathered that information from to give you their opinion or to like give you a summary of it, are they biased? You got to ask that too, right? So bias is just saying if somebody's reliable on the surface, right? Do they have some of the reason to be biased, right? Obviously, somebody can also be unreliable and unbiased, but it's just pointing out there's these like two little subtle levels there that you got to keep in mind. And also just again, just keep in mind the differences. Are other outlets reporting it? So this notion of our other outlets reporting it is basically just kind of this is sort of like trying to use some common sense. So particularly the more outlandish something is. So when you see something, you see a headline or you see a little blurb or a quick video and it's just something so outrageous. It's a crazy quote, it's a crazy headline, it's some video of some atrocity, and you're like, oh my God. Or if somebody even makes a comment, right? They say something, you see a public figure say something that sounds so terrible. They're like, did you know A is happening? Use some common sense. The more, especially the more outrageous it is, right? So if A was really happening, don't you think other people would be talking about it and reporting on it? If they're not, that means it's probably not true because they would be, especially again, the more outrageous it is. And it's amazing how many people just don't even bother applying that test. And they, give themselves whatever reason why other people aren't reporting it. It's ridiculous, right? If something is going to get clicks and headlines, other people are going to want those clicks and headlines too. They're going to report on it, right? So one of the basic tests to see if something's accurate or whether or not you should buy into it is to ask yourself, well, is it out there? Is it pervasive? Pervasive meaning is it everywhere, right? Are other people reporting this? If other people are not reporting it, it's probably not true, right? It probably means it's a fake video. It probably means that's not really what's happening there, right? If you don't see other people reporting it. And, you have all these like, this kind of goes into too, just like something we see in recent years in the news, like, the excuse as to why other people aren't reporting it and why only one side has a scoop, so to speak, or one like little area, or why one person has the headline and nobody else does, is all these different conspiracy theories about how it's a cover up or it's all this and that. It's like, again, use some common sense. Uh, all major news organizations are filled with people from all over the country who went to all kinds of different schools, have all kinds of backgrounds, who also, by the way, have worked for multiple companies, including companies on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, if you think news is biased. The notion that they're all just massively covering something up and you're only hearing about it, and because of that, you're only hearing about it in one place is absurd. It is just defies all logic and rationality because these people all come from different backgrounds. Why would they all agree on this cover up? What's the reason for it, right? They have no reason to all agree. Again, some of them have worked for companies that everybody accuses of being on one side, while they simultaneously then turned around and worked for the other company. So they're not homogenous, meaning they're not all, a conspiracy like that only works if they all have the same mindset and background. They don't. So it doesn't, it's ridiculous. The reason you're not hearing about some of these things in other places is because it's fake. It's not real. It's not really what's happening. The outlandish headline or the crazy extreme video probably is fake, right? So ask yourself if it's pervasive. That's one of like the common tests. Is it everywhere, right? Or is it at least everywhere within a short amount of time? Obviously, sometimes people get a scoop, right, and they get it first and they get it early. But eventually, if you're not seeing that everywhere, then it's probably because it's not a thing. Uh, so just kind of be aware of that. So if you think about it, those four are kind of like the keys that I'd like to look at. So again, reliability, which is basically just would they know? Is this somebody you trust to like come with this conclusion and give you the right information? Whether it's them or their sources. Biases, okay, even if they whether they're reliable or not, do they have skin in the game? They got a reason to lie to you, right? or not. So remember to consider that. Usually it's a financial motive. Would be a reason for bias. Are other outlets reporting it? Is basically just asking yourself, is this also being jumped on by other, whether it's news sources or social media, like is it out there, right? Because if it's only coming from one or two places, that probably is an indication that what you're looking at isn't real because they would have jumped on it. Another thing you will oftentimes see, it depends on the context you're watching this video, is certainly like college classes. We'll talk a lot about something called in library. This actually comes from librarian sort of research, but this notion of what's called the CRAP test. So the CRAP test is basically asking yourself, is the source, how current is it, right? How relevant is it? Uh, Authority, accuracy, and purpose, right? So you go through, and these are kind of like some of the same concepts I've been talking about here, just packaged in a slightly different way. Currency is currency is basically just dealing with this notion of is it recent or not, right? And so one of the things that happens with currency, why does old information potentially be inaccurate? Well, it's not because just because it's old doesn't mean it's inaccurate in and of itself, right? In other words, sometimes the wheel is still the wheel and it's still a useful wheel. Like just because of the things, you don't have to like change it. Sometimes we had the right idea before and it's still the right idea. However, currency matters because obviously, with as time passes, information can get updated, right? And now we have a differing opinion because of new information or more information. The other issue is people just change their opinion. So, especially when we're looking at like quotes. So you can take, for example, public figures or politicians, and I can find plenty examples. You might be aware of them where politicians have said A, and then you skip ahead a couple years and now they're saying B, the polar opposite. Like they're saying black and then they're saying white. It's right. And so now some people will say that's flip-flopping. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but it whether it's flip-flopping or they just legitimately change their opinion, right? Which can happen too, that's fine. Um it's either whatever the reason, it still means that currency matters, right? It still means that you have to take that into account. So you have to be careful about that. So make sure you check that it's current. And the CRAP test is, I have that as the last one on my list. CRAP test is also looking at that. Relevance is just basically dealing with, are you looking at information that's really relevant to like the conclusion you're trying to reach, right? Authority is very similar to my notion of like authority and accuracy is very similar to my notion of reliability. And then you deal with authority again, would they know, that kind of stuff, right? Are they being accurate, right? Is it reliable? And then purpose, of course, like what is the reason for this? And that's kind of going into bias. So you maybe have heard of the CRAP test. That's kind of, I would say, the most common acronym that's used for people to like assess sources and things like that. But I think it's actually more useful just break it down like I have, where it's reliability, bias, are the outlets reporting it, and is it current? So, and I think one of the things that you have to keep in mind, um, again, I mentioned in recent years is this proliferation of sort of allegations, so much of like news bias or misinformation and fake news, and you can't trust this and you can't trust that. Look, is there misinformation out there? There absolutely is. I mean, is there literal fake information out there? Sure, there is. Now, why does that spread? Unfortunately, a lot of that, quite frankly, just works because of people's laziness. Because and what I mean by that is people are so lazy that all they do is read a headline. I mean, if they click on something, and a lot of people just get stuff from social media right now, and if something's two paragraphs or more longer, it's too long, didn't read, right? If a video is more than a minute, too long, didn't watch. And unfortunately, guess what? To understand the real picture and the full picture of things and to understand the truth, sometimes the truth is longer than two paragraphs. Sometimes you gotta like pay attention for more than a minute, right? You might have to watch a video longer than that. So when you're just reading headlines, and we're in this culture where people are very, they're just lazy, right? They're just fragmented, where they just don't have an attention span. They don't consume a lot of information. That it's easy to lie to them, right? Because they're not going to do their homework. I can put the outrageous headline on social media, or the outrageous quote, or the AI video, and people will just buy it because they can't be bothered to spend 5 minutes actually reading more into what actually happened, right? Or doing any kind of Googling, right? And so it works because of a lot of that. And then you have our access to information, right? Like we have all this information at our fingertips now, whether just by having access to the internet, and not only the proliferation of the internet, but social media and our phones, right? We've got the internet constantly right there in our hands. So you have easy access to information, short attention span, not doing our homework, and that's how a lot of misinformation spreads, unfortunately. Now, how can you combat that? A big way to combat that is to actually, for things that matter to you, things that you care about, is to actually put in the effort to do some research and learn about those things. Learn about them, find out, spend more than 2 paragraphs reading or 1 minute watching a video, right? Or just reading a headline. And not only doing your homework, but looking at more than one source, right? Looking at sources from both sides of the aisle, like that kind of stuff. And that's how you can kind of combat it and get a more accurate picture of things. It's unfortunately just something we're going to constantly have to deal with because there's money to be made in shaping people's opinions. And not just money to be made, but obviously ideologies, right, to be promulgated and sort of adopted by a culture by shaping how they vote and things like that. Now, another thing, I've mentioned this in previous videos that I will say, just kind of wrap up this notion of like information bias and being careful about that. So again, you got to do your homework. If you do your homework and you look at a lot of sources, you take some real time to research something, a lot of times you can flesh out misinformation. Now, I will say again, I'd alluded to this a little bit earlier. I do think this notion of like all information is bias and fake and blah 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 is totally overblown. Not every news outlet's lying to you. They don't all have an agenda. They're not all. It's not all some conspiracy. And the reason I'm saying that kind of sarcastically is like I just said it a minute ago. For that to be true, I mean, the odds of that, the illogic of that type of thought, the reason that is so crazy. First of all, that's just like ridiculous, and the reason it's so ridiculous is because the people that work in these companies, right? Whoever you want to accuse of being biased, whether it's NBC News, ABC News, all of these places, CNN, right? You do realize they've got editors, journalists that have come from all kinds of places across the country. So, in other words, different backgrounds. They came from red states and blue states, man, and they went where they could get a job. And some of them have worked for both sides. So some of them have worked for outlets that everybody's calling conservatively biased, and then they turn around and work for the outlet that everybody's calling liberally biased, right? So which is it? It's hard to get everybody together on a conspiracy when they're not all going to pull on the same side of the rope. Like think of a tug of war. And what I'm saying to you is people come from different backgrounds. We're very varied. We have different opinions, and that's true in the news business too. And so these companies are filled with people all pulling on different ends of the rope in terms of their personal ideologies. So therefore, because they all come from different backgrounds and different places, and some of them have, like I said, worked for companies that we accuse of being biased on both sides. So therefore, the thought that they would all like join forces together within one company and agree to some agenda is a little ridiculous, right? It just doesn't. Yeah, again, hard to do when people don't agree on things to get them to all agree on something all of a sudden, right? And so I think it's really heavily overblown. And quite frankly, why a lot of it's overblown is because unfortunately we have a culture right now of very little accountability. And I'm not just talking about news. Like you can see this on social media, right? Where just like people just have no accountability. Um, they do something wrong, like somebody on social media, they do something wrong, they get called out on it, and instead of accepting responsibility for the bad behavior, their response is to say, well, you're a hater. I'm tuning out the noise. And then they post a picture of them in like Bose noise canceling headphones. I got those. Those are good. You got to get them. And they're like by the waterfall, right? It's a cop out. Like, first of all, what noise are you tuning out? What, you mean the noise you created by doing the bad thing? If you didn't do the bad thing, there would be no noise to tune out. If you didn't do the bad thing, there wouldn't be haters. How about this? Don't do bad things, right? So there's like just no accountability. Now coming back to news, right? That I thought I should bring that up because I made the comment no accountability. But like coming back to the news thing, right? Um, what happens now, unfortunately, is the news reports something that people don't like, um, that either is criticizing them or criticizing a belief they have, and instead of um, being accountable for maybe their belief is wrong, right? Or they were misguided or misjudged something, or that maybe their guy or girl did a bad thing. Their response is to basically just call it fake, right? Well, something isn't fake just because you don't like it, right? Something isn't true because you don't like the truth, because it's inconvenient for you, right? If Ted Bundy was alive today and I called him a serial killer, he'd get to like call it fake news and go on social media and say he's tuning out the noise, right? Ted Bundy is a serial killer. We have DNA evidence of that, and it's confessions. But right, just because you don't like to hear something doesn't make it fake. It's still real. Sorry, you don't like to hear it. And it doesn't make it biased. Just because the news is telling you something you don't want to hear. That's not bias. That's not fake. That's an inconvenient truth. If you don't like it, then maybe you should be accountable for that truth and make some changes to correct it, right? Maybe not do the bad things, ride a different horse, so to speak, and not back somebody who does bad things. It's not fake because you don't like it. And it's not biased because you don't like it. It's not an agenda because you don't like what you're hearing. And so we see a lot of that in the culture today, where people just accuse news organizations of being biased because they just don't like what's being reported, right? I'm sorry, the truth is hard to hear, but it doesn't make it biased. So I didn't mean to go on like a huge rant about that, but my point about like some of this discussion about misinformation or fake news, if you will, is yes, it's absolutely out there and it's absolutely a problem, particularly on social media, because social media platforms are designed for like quick hits, right? Just a headline, just a short video, just a paragraph. So it's a real problem. And there is a problem with news bias too. That is a real problem. There are news outlets that are super biased. And I think we know that, right? Whether it's conservative or liberal. So, like, that's true too. It is a real problem. But my point is, it's not necessarily, particularly with like mainstream news organizations, it's not as like so out of control as everybody's acting, right? Like I think part of why they're acting like it's out of control is because they just don't like the truth about what's being reported. Uh, um, and so that's kind of what I'm trying to say. It's a problem, but it's not as widespread of an issue in mainstream news outlets as people are acting like. I guess is what I'm trying to say. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. But these are the ways you can test a source's credibility when you're trying to look at sources, whether it's forming sort of like your own opinion, sort of like making an argument that convinces yourself. Whether it's an argument that you're writing like in a paper, right, for that sort of stuff, or like a college paper, or you're giving a presentation or a speech, obviously, in those situations as well. This is how you want to vet your sources when you're trying to determine if they are good sources to be using. So let's talk a little bit about, we talk about like sources of information. Let's talk a little bit about common reasoning biases. So, for example, let's say you're getting like valid sources of information, they're reliable, they're not biased, it's current, right? All this sorts of stuff, right? Let's talk about some other things that can kind of go wrong and sort of the evaluating evidence, or really, this is also kind of now talking about reaching conclusions in some respects, right? So, you've got what's called selective exposure, selective retention, confirmation bias, and framing. And I've mentioned some of these in previous videos, but these are basically natural traits that people have when they're sort of evaluating evidence and then reaching a conclusion, right? So we all kind of fall into these, and these can bias our conclusion, right? And also sometimes bias the evaluating evidence process. So selective exposure is looking only at information that will confirm your prior attitudes. So we actually have a tendency to only expose ourselves to information that we think is going to tell us what we want to hear. So, we were just talking about news. Example of that would be if you are politically liberal, let's say you're politically liberal leaning, that person, you follow the news, that person likely goes home and they watch Fox News. I'm sorry, they watch MSNBC, and it's the only thing they watch, MS Now, right? Why? Because MSNBC, formerly MSNBC, now called MS Now, they're known to be a very liberal news network, right? So you go home, they're going to tell you what you want to hear because you're politically liberal. Somebody who is more politically conservative leaning, they're more likely to go home and they just watch Fox News. Fox News is known to be politically conservative, right? It's going to tell them what they want to hear, and that's it. Now, the problem with this is only exposing yourself to evidence, to sources, or in this case, news outlets, right? Since we're going to use this example, that is kind of on your side of the aisle, so to speak, is you're only getting one-sided information, right? So, and that then biases your conclusions and your opinions because you then are only really getting a feedback loop that is reinforcing what you already thought. So you already believed A, you're exposing yourself to information that's telling you A, so it's this feedback loop of A. You never consider B, C, and D. And there is research that shows, like using that news example, where you can pull audiences who only watch a certain network, and then you ask them about their political opinions, and their political opinions will mirror that network, right? Now, maybe with that research, you can argue it's chicken or the egg. Like, which one, is the network telling the audience what they think they want to hear, or are they giving you the opinion? Like, that's, I guess, up for debate. But the point is that selective exposure, like, it creates this potential problem, right, where you're just not getting the other side. Selective retention. So this is actually a weird one that a lot of people aren't as aware of, which is that we tend to only remember information that agrees with us. So an example would be, um, I teach interpersonal communication sometimes courses, college courses as well. And in those courses, we have a whole section on relationships. So one of the things that can happen in relationships is a relationship ends, and then you get removed from that relationship an amount of time. You're no longer grieving the relationship. You're no longer going through, let's say it's an intimate relationship. You're no longer going through the breakup. You've kind of moved on, right? So now we get a couple of years down the road. And you will oftentimes, it doesn't have to be an intimate relationship, it could be any kind of relationship. You will oftentimes look back at that relationship more fondly as time passes, right? And what's going on there is you tend to be remembering the good times and kind of forgetting the bad, right? So that's selective retention. You kind of like the bad falls by the wayside and you remember the good. And it doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with that per se. It might just make you a happier person in life, but it's still just be aware of what's going on there. A little bit of that is selective retention, where you're kind of only remembering the good part. And there might have been, if you think about it as a relationship, hey, there was a reason you broke up, right? Like, it might not be as great as you're like looking back upon it as, but that's selective retention. So a little bit of a weird one, but that can obviously create biased conclusions because we're only going to remember the stuff that agrees with us. Framing is when you present information from a strategic angle. So this is when you purposely try to spin it. So I mentioned before, this would be like, I want you to view something a certain way. So I present it in a way that's going to make it look like lead you to that conclusion, right? And a frame can be the truth, but the truth looks like maybe only part of the truth, right? To make you reach a certain conclusion. It could be a certain spin on the truth. A frame could be a lie. It could be a mixture between the lie and the truth, and that's where it can be really effective when you spin or frame things, so to speak, is because if it's a mixture of a lie and the truth, is it's hard sometimes for the audience who's or somebody else who's hearing that argument to know where the truth ends and the lie begins, right? If you mix them well. So that's what framing or spinning something is on purpose. Obviously, that can create biases, especially if the source where you're getting the evidence, right? We're focusing on evaluating evidence, right? So if somebody's giving you a piece of information that you're using to reach a conclusion, if that's the evidence they're giving, or maybe if their evidence is a conclusion in of itself, they're like, the piece of evidence is, hey, you should believe A, and you're trying to decide, should I believe A? Right? Well, if they're purposely framing that, right, then that can create a problem. And then confirmation bias is interpreting evidence as confirming one's existing attitudes. So this is a scenario where you already think A, and or no, let me rephrase that. You want to believe A. It could be A or B, but you want to believe A. And so anytime you get information, you kind of interpret it as A, right? It could be B. It could be telling you B actually, but I want to believe A. So I'm gonna kind of try as much as I can to spin it to A, right? And so that's confirmation bias. It's really common. A lot of people don't always even realize they're doing it. Again, when I teach interpersonal, I show a short video in there, and it's a skit. They're kind of making fun of it, but where it's this guy, he goes into a coffee shop and and the barista is really nice to him, and she's very attractive, and he thinks she's flirting with him and likes him. And at the end, he goes to ask her out, and of course, he's wrong about all of this. But that's kind of an example of confirmation bias, right? Where you think, this person thinks that the girl likes him. He he wants to think that, right? He likes her, so he's hoping that she's indeed flirting with him. And so anything she does that could be A or B, like B in this case would be she's just being nice because you're a paying customer and she works for tips, right? Which is the likely outcome here. It could be B, but because he likes her and wants her to like him, he's going to interpret it as A. So that's confirmation bias. So very, very common tactic that you see in a lot of things where people go in already wanting to believe something. So they that's the way to think of it. They already want to believe something, and so they interpret any evidence they get. They lean to interpret it as, "Hey, see, my belief was true," right? So these are all things that can really bias either our evidence gathering process or the conclusions we reach based on a given piece of evidence. Now, so a couple of other things that I want you to keep in mind when it comes to evaluating evidence and really kind of at a larger scale, also just evaluating arguments too, right? So now we're kind of getting a little bit into just evaluating arguments as well, not just the evidence. But you need to think about every element of the Tolman model, right? So remember, the Tolman model of argumentation is basically just saying that an argument has three parts. You have a claim, which is the conclusion that the speaker is trying to support, right? You've got data, which is something that supports that claim, and then you've got a warrant, which is an unstated assumption that has to be true in order for the data to be relevant to the claim. Okay, so any argument, whether you agree with the argument, whether you think it's valid or not, has to have these three parts. So to give you that example, it would be if I said, if my conclusion is the team is going to win tonight. Okay, and my data, the reason I say they're going to win is I say they're playing at home. Okay, what is the unstated assumption that has to be true for that to make any sense? It's that home teams win, right? Is that there is a home court, home field advantage in whatever sport we're talking about, right? Because if there wasn't, then that would make no sense as a piece of supporting evidence, right? And so an argument has to have all three, right? An argument has to have all three. So let's say you just have, for example, a claim. That this is, by the way, something that happens a lot in society where like culture where people aren't really making arguments or just making statements. So that would be like somebody just says, well, that's un-American. That's their claim. And then you say, why? And then they go, that's not what we do here. Okay. Because it is, because it's un-American, right? What do? They just stated the claim again, right? Because it's not what we do. So you didn't say why it's not what we, right? Like, you're just restating the conclusion twice, right? So a lot of people, by the way, do that. They go around making claims and there's nothing to back it up. They just restate their conclusion again. Um, but anyway, an argument has to have all three parts, right? So when you're evaluating evidence, and now we're talking about a larger scale, just arguments in general, one of the things that you need to do is just ask yourself, is there a problem with the claim, the data, or the warrant? Look at all three phases, right? So for example, let's say the evidence is sound, since we've been talking so much about evidence, right? So it's reliable, it's not biased, the evidence you have is correct, right? How could the claim then still be wrong? Why should you still look at it does just because the evidence is correct doesn't mean every conclusion you draw from that evidence is correct too. That is not true. Why is that? Well, for example, the claim could be too broad, right? Let's say I do a study of students at a college and I look at nursing students. And then based on that, and I do the study, it's a valid study. I follow the scientific method perfectly. It's peer reviewed. It's all these things, right? It crosses all the T's and dots all the I's. So the data is correct, but then I reach a conclusion that says college students in this state, or just college students in the United States, or just I just say college students in general, believe A, B, or C based on the results of this study. That conclusion is too broad because I didn't look at college students. I looked at one college, and even more specifically, I only looked at students with a certain major. So the only conclusion I can reach is really students at that college with that major, right? So sometimes your conclusion's too broad, right? Sometimes you are not reading from the information what you really should be reading from it. So in other words, sometimes the evidence is valid, but it's maybe telling you five true things, but that's it, and you are somehow interpreting from that thing six and seven that isn't true, right? So evaluate every part of a Tolman model: the claim, the data, the warrant, right? So the warrant is this unstated assumption. Um, so the unstated assumption that has to be true to connect the two. Well, one of the ways that that can be that's faulty. One of the interesting things about that is that can oftentimes be faulty, and people don't always catch it because it's not stated, right? It's this like it's an assumption that's being made, right? That's sort of like it's being inferred, it's being implied. And so you got to ask yourself about that. Is the argument implying something, right? Is it inferring something that just isn't accurate, right? And so when you look at an argument, I'm just saying make sure to determine if an argument's valid. We've been discussing a lot about, excuse me, how to determine if evidence is valid, right? But what I'm saying is when you're evaluating evidence, then to use in an argument, once you've evaluated the evidence, you also got to make sure the claim is valid as well, right? And you also got to look at the warrant. And even some of these reasoning biases we just discussed, we're starting to get at some of these evaluations of the conclusion. So you have to evaluate all three parts, right? Just make sure you think about that, right? So, and by the way, a way that the warrant could be bad, we've talked about why datas could be bad or why maybe some of your conclusions could be bad. The way a warrant can go wrong would be maybe it's just an assumption that is not true, right? That like we hold, but just like it's almost like a cliche, right? There could be a cliche that's out there that just really isn't very true, but yet it's something that we have, right? It's sort of like a myth, so to speak. So the assumption, the warrant part might not be true. Like for example, what if in this case with this team, what if this team had a terrible home record, right? Or they actually played better on the road, right? Then that warrant wouldn't be true. So make sure you're just assessing all three. Okay. Another thing that I think actually gets like lost in the sauce a little bit, I think this is a good thing to keep in mind just for life, like whether you're using this in a college class or not. I think this is a good thing to how to apply this stuff to your everyday life, or even whether or not you're using it in your workplace, just like in your even in your interpersonal life, just like anything like that. Is you need to you also need to evaluate, first of all, is the argument actually true? And then even if it is true, and just because an argument is true doesn't mean it's one you should be driven or motivated by, or you should use as the basis of your decision. I know that sounds really counterintuitive, but bear with me here. So, is the argument valid? So, I talk a lot about, I've certainly talked in other videos, and you'll have heard, if not from me, but certainly in other places, where this notion of you have three types of arguments, right? You have logos, ethos, and pathos. And logos are appeals to logic, like the Tolman model, right? You've got ethos, which are appeals to credibility, right? So believe my conclusion because it's supported by something we essentially always trust or presume is valid. So this is the classic trust me, I'm a doctor, right? Trust me because of my experience, my credentials, my expertise. And then pathos are emotional appeals. Okay. So this is doing this because it gives you some sort of emotional feeling that you want, right? It makes you happy. It relieves anxiety or stress or what have you, right? So the first question is just whatever argument you're dealing with is just asking yourself, is it a legitimate argument, right? Is the argument they're presenting true or not, right? And it might not be true, right? Like, so just ask, is this logical argument correct, right? Is this appeal to credit? So when somebody says, trust me, I'm a doctor, um, or yeah, but that's, just because somebody's a doctor doesn't mean you're going to take, advice about your car. They're not a mechanic, right? Um, so it's asking yourself those types of things, right? Like, is the argument true? And I know, like the mechanic thing, you're like, I wouldn't do that. But you see this all the time, like where an argument it appears. Um, you probably haven't maybe necessarily heard this word. But have you ever heard the term specious? So the term specious, this will make you sound smart with your friends, I guess. The term specious is an argument that, like, essentially it seems true on its surface, or at first glance, you were like, yeah, that's true. but it's actually not. When you actually look under the hood, you're like, that's not real. That's not a thing. So an example of this, like the doctor and the mechanic thing. For example, there's all kinds of books written, audio books, podcasts now, where it'll say like in the description, hosted by, like, let's say it's a podcast, hosted by PhD, blah blah blah, how to win at business, right? 7 Days to a Better You by PhD, blah blah blah, right? And but if you actually look inside the jacket of the book, or if you do some homework on the host, whoever's hosting the podcast, their PhD is in English. They have no business experience, right? Their PhD is not in psychology. It's in something else. It's in history. I don't know, right? And so, but they throw out PhD there because, again, I mentioned before, this is very similar to like the whole misinformation, fake news thing. Is people are just so lazy, they don't do their homework. They don't actually look into this person says, right, they have the letters behind their name, but is that actually their background? And it's not. You'd be surprised. There's a lot of like business books, especially where all of these people are writing all these guru things, and their like background is they were an English major and they have a PhD in English. They've never run a business at all, right? I mean, speaking of business, there's lots of people like that. Another example would be like you see this in popular culture, where somebody's giving business advice, or they're perceived as being this great business person, this great businessman or woman, because they have a lot of money, and people just presume, well, they must be successful. Well, are they, or were they born on third base? You ever heard the phrase "born on third base"? That's kind of an old man phrase, I guess. Your grandfather, your pop might tell you that. But it basically means it's like, so take the money business example. So if I was born with a lot of money and already had a lot of money, I can go out and start all kinds of businesses. And whether they fail or succeed won't matter because I have so much money to cover it up if they fail. Like I could file bankruptcy a million times. And because I still have a bunch of money, you'll think I'm a success. Happens all the time. There's lots of examples of that. People in popular culture who everybody praises as being successful. Again, look under the hood. Are they successful? Um, and so that's an example of a specious argument, right? That person can walk in the room and be like, hey, look, I'm listen to my business arguments, my business advice, which is basically kind of an appeal to credibility because of my background. You should listen to me, right? But in reality, that argument is specious. It looks true on the surface, but it's not because they have money to cover up the mistakes. They're actually not very successful at anything, right? At least business related. But they can cover up the mistakes. So that's kind of an example of this. Or like my example with the podcast host or the book, the person that writes the 7 Ways to a Better Business and their PhDs in English, right? Where again, those are both appeals to credibility, but the argument appears on its face to be true, but it's not if you look under the hood. So another thing to keep in mind, whether it's not just evaluating evidence, but just evaluating conclusions, what I'm trying to say is when an argument gets presented to you, whether it's an appeal to credibility, like those two were appeals to credibilities, the being successful at business but having money, so it's hard to tell if they were actually successful since they started with money, or the person who says PhD when they're hosting a podcast on business, but their PhDs in English. Those are appeals to credibility that if you look under the hood aren't true. But obviously, you should consider this with logical arguments, emotional arguments that like people make with you that appear on the surface to be true, but they're not really true. Now, I said that like a lot of this can like help you. I think it's important for your life. Here's the part that I think is also that's like really important to keep in mind. I think could be valuable in your life. Okay, and it's this: just because an argument's true doesn't mean it should actually inform your decision or that you have to go with it or be driven by it. And again, I know that sounds a little odd to hear, but here's what I mean by that. Um, do people do things that are counterproductive to them, meaning it's against their self interest? They do it all the time. Okay. So take somebody that's overweight. I'm overweight. And so when I eat too much food or if I eat something that's unhealthy, that is counterproductive to me. That's very harmful in a lot of ways to my life, whether it's physically or other aspects, right? But yet, clearly, I'm still overweight, so I still do that, right? Now, when I make that decision, the moment that I'm eating a pizza instead of a salad, right? Or not working out or not going to the gym or whatever it may be, right? That's you're not doing to lose weight. Um, in that moment of decision, um, I'm obviously not doing what's logical. So like I'm not following a logical argument. I'm not following an appeal to credibility. In fact, I'm clearly doing what's counterproductive to me, what's not healthy. So why am I doing it? Well, the pizza just tastes good, right? Or pizza tastes better in a salad, and it's definitely feels better to just sleep in than get up early and go to the gym or go for a walk, right? So what are you doing? You're making an emotional decision. You're doing what makes you feel better, right? Um, Now that emotional decision in the long run has more negative consequences than benefits, right? It's not good to make that decision. But yet it gets made. I do it, and there's other people that do it, right? Um, so it's it's a real emotion. It's a valid argument, so to speak. It does feel better to just sleep in. The pizza does taste better. So my emotions aren't lying to me. So it's a valid argument. You know what the real problem is? The problem is in that moment of decision, when I choose the burger instead of the salad or the fruit, right? Or when I choose to sleep in instead of work out, the problem is that I'm letting a valid emotional feeling and a valid emotional argument, if you will, drive me. Like I'm letting that be the decision maker. I'm living my life in that moment off of emotion when I shouldn't, right? Like, what would be the wise thing to do in that moment? Is to say to yourself, it may feel better, it may taste better to eat the burger and it may feel better to sleep in, but I'm not going to listen to that valid emotion, right? I'm going to do what's counter to that because I'm going to listen to logic at this point. I'm going to listen to what's better for my health, right? That's what I should be doing, or a person in that situation should be doing. So, where I'm going with this is, and this happens particularly with emotion, by the way, with emotional arguments, and in this case, it's arguments we make with ourselves, is sometimes an argument is valid, but you still got to ask yourself, is that ultimately what I should do, though, whether it's valid or not, right? Like, yeah, the burger tastes better, but is that what I should do? Okay. And by the way, yeah, I can revert. So, in other words, there's times when you shouldn't listen to the emotional argument, is what I'm saying, even though it's valid and real. It would make you feel better, but you still shouldn't do it. Um, and you can flip that because there's also times when you should do what is emotionally going to make you feel better, right? An example and not do the logical thing. So, like with your health, you probably should be doing the logical thing, but I could flip it. There's other examples too. So, a flip would be there's times when you could do something that is more productive, right? When you should be doing something productive and you're not. You just want to veg out. You just need to relax. You just need to unwind, right? Or let yourself go, whatever it may be. And so what's going on there? You're not listening, just like the food example, like somebody is overweight, right? You're listening to your emotions instead of logic. Now, I think in those situations, you can make a valid argument that that's actually better for your life. Like it's you're probably going to be happier if you let yourself go sometimes, right? It's okay to sometimes not always be productive. Sometimes you really do need a day to just kind of unwind. Sometimes you just need a break, right? And that's okay. Not every night spent, on Netflix is a waste of time. Even if you just binge watched your favorite show because you just needed a break, right? And so what I'm saying is, you got to like take it when you're presented with arguments, whether these are from your personal life, whether it's your personal life or your work life, or whatever the argument is, you got to ask yourself, like, a, is it valid, and even if it is valid, is that what I'm gonna let be the final decision maker here? Is that going to be the final boss or not? And you sometimes got to like make different calls there, right? Sometimes it's okay to let emotion drive you, and sometimes you should let logic drive you, right? Sometimes when you need a break, it's okay, you need to unwind, it's okay to let emotion of I'll just feel better if I get to unwind drive you, or let myself go. And sometimes when you got to take care of your health, to use that example, you've got to learn to override your emotion and let logic drive the bus, right? And so I'm just saying, keep that in mind in your life, right? Like, think about that. Think about, um, whether this argument's valid or not, but also, even if it's valid, should I really be making that decision right now or not? Even if it is a valid argument, right? So, Just something to keep in mind with like how you use arguments. So, all right. Last thing to kind of look at here is personal principles to apply when using sound evidence. So, what this is now, this is kind of up to you for the most part, but there has been some research on what do audiences expect. So, when somebody is either literally a person one on one hearing your argument or audiences of a speech, this has been studied in all kinds of like other like more modern landscapes. So, for example, just even like when people like listen to a podcast, people or watch a show on YouTube, right? Like, what do they expect from the content creator if we're talking about YouTube or a podcast or the speaker at a speech presentation? What do they expect that person to do when it comes to how they present evidence and arguments with them? So it's almost like what are their ethical principles, so to speak, that they're looking for. So this is what audiences report that they are expecting of you. So these are some things that it's recommended, like as sort of best practices that you always apply. So the first one is to be objective. And what that just means is honestly discuss shortcomings and opposing views. Um, don't they don't want you to frame things, right? They want you to present an argument that sort of like, you can make the argument that people should do A and not B, but you can still do it in an objective way without slanting the facts, right? Without hiding information. You can still just convince them honestly and ethically. So they expect you to do that. Be objective, honest, and honestly, again, discuss opposing alternatives, opposing arguments. Don't ignore those things. Um, and also honestly discuss shortcomings, right? Like honestly discuss holes in your argument, right? Things like that. So just be transparent, right? Second thing is don't oversimplify. So one of the common things that people sort of get criticized for later, or arguments or audiences feel misled, is when you basically just oversimplify the process and you left out a lot of the details or the hard work, and it people just make it feel like you were then disingenuous, right, about like how difficult something was, or how easy or readily it was to be, how achievable was it. So don't oversimplify things. If something is more complicated or it takes more work, bring that up, right? Don't just gloss over things. And then also manage people's expectations. And what I mean by that is, this is actually a common mistake that gets made. It's a very much like an untrained kind of mistake, which is where people tend to come when they're trying to persuade somebody. What they do is they come into a situation and they tend to only focus on the best case scenario. So they come in the room and they're like, "Hey, do what I want. I want you to do A, and if you do A, you could get a 10." So if you think of it as like on a scale of think of it as like on a scale of 1 to 10. If 10 is the best case outcome, the best case scenario, and like 0 is baseline, it's where you're at today. 1 would be slight benefit, 10 is the best case scenario. So they tell people, all right, they come there and they go, all right, if you should do what I want, you should do A, because if you do A, you can get a 10, a 10, a 10, 10. Wouldn't a 10 be awesome? Isn't a 10 amazing? And so people are like, yeah. And let's say you give that speech to 50 people, and 25 agree to do what you want. And of the 25, five get a 10, and the other 20, like some got five, some got seven, some got three, some got two. They got all kinds of different results, right? Well, here's the problem. When you only talk about the best case scenario, you have actually set yourself up for most people to be disappointed in you, to be unhappy. Or at least they'll feel, I shouldn't say unhappy, but feel some disappointment. Now, how can I say that? Here's what's going on. So let's say you meet back with them. So of those 25 people, the five that got a 10, they're going to be happy. They got the best case scenario. But the people that got a 5, for example, or the people that got a 4, they're the ones that are going to be in other words, the other 20 people, 80% or whatever, they're going to be disappointed because they didn't get the 10, right? And all they heard, I mean, they're going to be somewhat like, yeah, I got a 4, that's great. But they're going to go, but man, it's not that 10. I really wish I had that 10, right? And so, um, what you do is when you only focus on the pie in the sky, the best case, the moon and the stars, the people that don't get the moon and the stars will then be disappointed. I mean, they'll still be happy they got something, but they'll still be comparing it to that moon and the stars they didn't get. So, one of the first ways to manage people's expectations is don't just describe the ceiling of results, describe the floor and everything in between. So you shouldn't just describe the 10. You should describe the 7. You should describe the 5. You should describe the 3, whatever it may be as well. So now, why is that? Because the difference is the first person comes in the room and they go, "Do what I want," and you could get a 10, and a 10 is it. Wouldn't that be awesome? And the second person comes, and what they've done is they've set it up to where anybody who doesn't get the awesome, who doesn't get 10, is going to be disappointed. Now, the second person who comes in the room and says, "Do what I want," and you could get a 10, look at a 10. Isn't a 10 awesome? I agree. But you know what? If you do what I want, I hope you get a 10. But even if you don't get a 10, you can get a 7, and that's still pretty good. And you can get a 5, and that's pretty good. And you can get a 4. And you know what? Even if you get a 2, you'll be better off tomorrow than you are today because a 2 is better than 0. Now, what that person has done is they've come in the room and they basically have said, "Do what I want." And you could get a 10. But even if you don't get a 10, you have something to gain and nothing to lose because you'll be better off tomorrow than you are today. And now, pretty much anybody who does what you want is going to be happy. Okay. So in other words, then when you meet with those 25 people, the people that got a 5 will be like, he was right. He or she was right. I got a 4. I got a 5. I'm better tomorrow. I'm better now than I was, right? So that's one way to manage people's expectations. So describe all the possible beneficial outcomes. So that way anybody that gets one of those outcomes is way more likely to be happy, right? So that's what you got to do with that. Um, there's other things you can do to kind of manage expectations, like some other classic things you should always do when it comes, especially when you're persuading people in an argument or in a speech. So these would be, and these are more like business tips, but it's things like, for example, always under promise and over deliver. So an example would be, if you think something is going to take 3 weeks, tell people 4 weeks, not 3. Now, why is that? Because then when you get it done in 3, which is the amount of time you thought it would take, it looks like you got it done early. You under promised, over delivered, right? And this, you also built in a buffer week. So if anything goes wrong, right, you can cover yourself because you got an extra week. People do this with price points. If you want to profit $100 off something, build it into where you're going to profit 120. That way, and then at the end you can go, "Oh, you know what? For whatever, however manner, I was able to get you another $20 off. How's your pal? I sell smiles, right? Aren't I great? Under promise, over deliver, right? Like it looks like I saved you $20 in the end. I didn't save you $20. I always wanted to profit $100, right? I just built in a little extra profit so I could cut you a discount at the end, right? So under promise, over deliver is a common one. So these are some other ways to manage expectations. But I would think certainly for arguments or for public speaking, the big one is describe all the possible outcomes. And again, don't oversimplify. So these are just some things to keep in mind when you're evaluating evidence, when you're looking at sources, when you're also just evaluating if an argument is valid. And then, of course, also some principles that audiences expect you to apply when making arguments or presenting evidence to them. So I hope you found this video useful, and I will see you guys in the next one.